Hey, College Math, welcome back. Here is section 1.4.1. We're talking about guidelines to analyzing a statistical study. So 1.4 is kind of a beefy section, so we're splitting it up into two parts. I didn't really feel like making you watch a 40-minute video, so that's why we're going to cover it in 2 different days, okay? So our objectives for this section is to list the steps for conducting a statistical survey, and then we're also going to describe the first 4 guidelines for analyzing a statistical study or a statistical result, okay? Because a lot of the times when you consume media, like on social media or in the news, you're going to get lots of statistical results. And so this can also apply to things you see or hear in your daily lives, okay? It'll be good to just kind of recap so far what we've seen in chapter 1. You don't have to write this part down, this chapter 1 recap, especially because you're going to be writing a lot of this video. So don't worry about writing this part down, just kind of reviewing what we've seen so far in this chapter. First section, we covered the basics, where we talked about variable population sample, kind of the setup for the next sections we're going to look at, right? 1.2, we talked about the different ways to get a sample, okay, especially ways to get a sample that is representative and not biased, that we'll talk about here in a little bit. 1.3, we covered different types of studies that you can conduct, observational versus clinical. And now in this section, we're going to talk about looking at studies, because a lot of the times you're not really going to be doing your own studies, you're going to be looking at studies or just kind of consuming results of studies, okay? And so it's kind of good to be aware of how they get those results and how you can be kind of critical of those results, not just kind of take them for face value. So there are 6 steps to conducting a statistical study. It'd be a good place to start here on how to conduct the study, so you can kind of understand where all the guidelines that we're going to look at come from. Okay, so these are the steps for conducting a statistical study. Let's go ahead and write these down. These are not going to be the main focus, but it'll be good to have these written down and compare our guidelines to them, okay? So the first step is to state the goal of your study. What do you want to accomplish from the study? Second step is to state the population you want to study and make inferences about. So who or what, like what objects or which individuals do you want to study? Like what do you want to kind of come to a conclusion about? Third step is to then choose a sampling method and use it to gather your sample. Okay, so from the 5, and there's actually more than just those 5 methods that we covered in 1.2, but how do you want to gather your sample? And when you decide that, go ahead and get your sample. Fourth step is to collect the data from that sample and then summarize the data that you've gathered. Okay, there's lots of different ways you can summarize this data. We'll talk about how to summarize numerical data a lot in chapter 2. Step 5, use your data to make inferences about the population. Okay, so what did you learn about the data you gathered from your sample, and can you kind of make claims about the population based on that, right? And the last step, what are your conclusions? What did you learn? What would you do differently? That kind of idea. So knowing these steps, let's go ahead and talk about some guidelines for looking at a study or for thinking about statistical results, okay? These are going to be the first 4 steps. In this video, we're only going to cover the first 4, and then in the second video, we'll look at the last 4, okay? So the first one is to look at the population, goal, and type of study, okay? Are these 3 things clearly stated, okay? You're not really going to have too much of an issue here, because people will definitely want to make sure this is stated well in order to have the rest of the study be good. But it's still good things to look for, okay? Does this person make their goal clear? Is it known what they're trying to achieve from their study? Is the population clearly defined? Okay, and that's kind of that thing we talked about when we did section 1.1. You don't just want to say students, you want to say high school students, you want to say middle school students. You want to try to be as specific and clear as possible. And then is the type of study appropriate? Like, should this person be using a clinical study for what they're trying to accomplish, or should it be observational, or the other way around, right? And so that's always something to look for, but you don't always have access to that information, especially when you're looking at just the results that you see a lot in the media, okay? So then the next one is where we can start actually seeing stuff ourselves and kind of having a better grip ourselves of how to interpret the study or how to think about the study. Okay, is the source of the study identified? Are there any concerns with the source? Okay, as we go through these, I'm going to highlight kind of the key word of the guideline because it's going to be hard to remember. 8 long sentences, whereas you can just remember kind of the keywords from them, right? So number 2 is all about the source, okay? The study might not be conducted or presented fairly if those who funded the study are biased, okay? And so here's a quick example of what that might look like, okay? There was once an ad in certain US newspapers that stated global warming was not happening. The ad gave reasons why based on certain studies that were conducted. At the bottom of the page in small print, there were the words that stated that the studies and ad were paid for by the oil and gas industry, okay? And so that right there is kind of an example of this guideline, okay? The studies and the ad were paid for by the oil and gas industry. So of course, the oil and gas industry are not going to want you to think that they're the ones causing global warming, right? And so they're going to pay for studies to show that that's not what is happening, right? Another way to think about this is a long time ago, tobacco companies used to conduct studies and kind of display results that showed that cigarettes are not causing lung cancer. They're not the main reason, like smoking does not give you lung cancer. But that is obviously not the case, right? And so those studies were paid for by the tobacco companies. And so this is one kind of idea about source kind of being, biasing the results of the study, because you can always sway numbers and twist numbers for your favor if they're not showing what you want them to show. You can always conveniently leave stuff out, put stuff in that's not necessarily false, but also not necessarily true, right? And so that's kind of the main issue with number 2. Always got to pay attention to the source. Is there something wrong with the source of this study? If so, I don't think I should immediately believe it, right? Just because the source seems like it's, this whole idea that, tobacco company funded studies that, cigarettes don't lead to lung cancer. While that is obviously not true, it doesn't always immediately lead to it, right? So it's always a matter of just being critical, okay, and not immediately believing it, but also not immediately thinking that it's false. Next guideline, are there any confounding variables that could skew the results of the study? So the third one, the main idea is confounding variables. Okay, we talked about that a little bit in 1.3, the video you watched the night before this one. Confounding variables, they are variables that could cause the effect that you're looking for, but it's not the variable that you were intending to cause that effect, right? So here's an example. A study was conducted to show that microwave ovens were dangerous. The study involved plants where one plant was given tap water and the other plant was given water that was boiled in the microwave. The plant that received the microwave water died, okay? And oops, I actually left out kind of a little bit of an important sentence. Then we would say the study concluded. Oops, I can't spell concluded. That microwaves were dangerous. Okay, so that was the conclusion from the study. And so one confounding variable here, they kind of made a big jump here. Think about what happened. We gave one plant tap water and we gave the other plant water that was boiled in the microwave, right? And they said that because the microwave water plant died, microwaves are bad. One thing that hopefully is jumping out at you is the fact that they gave a plant boiling water, okay? The fact that this water was boiled. That right there is the, kind of skewed that highlight right there. There we go. That is our confounding variable. So our confounding variable here is that water was boiled. Okay, because plants probably cannot withstand boiling point water. That's sure to kill the plant. Okay, it's not that, this is not to rule out that microwaves are bad. This does not immediately say, okay, because the water was boiling, it's not the microwave. It could very well still be the microwave. We don't know, but we cannot say that it wasn't the boiling water, right? You have to kind of account for these confounding variables, these other possibilities that might kind of screw up your study. Okay, and so that's why researchers kind of spend a lot of time, making their studies, because they're looking for other possible things that could lead to the outcome that they want, and they want to try to eliminate those or control those, right? So here, our confounding variable is boiling water. So I can't immediately believe that microwaves are dangerous, because it very well could have been that the boiling water killed your plant, okay? And now the last guideline for this video, could there be any bias from the sampling method, okay? So here, I think a better way to, instead of kind of highlighting a word here, a better way to summarize the fourth guideline is sample bias. Okay, so sample bias is the highlight from number 4. And there's 2 different types of sample bias we can encounter. We can encounter selection bias, which means that the sample that you chose is not a representative sample. We looked a little bit at this, especially like on a recent test. We don't want to pick a sample that's not representative. Think about the 100 students that go to Kickstand, and we're trying to do a study on the average % of students that like coffee. Okay, that is an example of selection bias if I were to pick those students going to Kickstand, because they probably already like coffee if they're going into Kickstand, right? And then the other type of bias is participation bias. Not all people in the sample respond to the survey, whatever the reasons might be. Okay, so this kind of this is more affecting observational studies, where you can give a survey, and where the survey is pretty much like optional, like you're not holding them to fill out the survey, like it's not a requirement. It's more of a like, hey, fill this out if you have time. Okay, that is what leads to participation bias. So here, let's look at this last example. Starting in 1916, a certain magazine used to be popular for predicting the winner of many presidential elections. In 1936, the magazine sent out 10 million mock ballots to its subscribers and to people who owned automobiles and/or telephones. And then 2 million ballots were returned, and the magazine actually predicted incorrectly this time around. Okay. So let's kind of dissect this a little bit, and let's look for, there's actually one example of each of these biases in this scenario. So let's look for selection bias, okay? The sample chosen is not a representative sample. So I'm gonna highlight that part. Let's do, I guess, this blue color. So the part that corresponds to the selection bias would be the fact that we chose subscribers of the magazine and people who owned automobiles and/or telephones, okay? Think about the time period. It's 1936, okay? Even if everyone was subscribed to this magazine, or even if there were a lot of subscribers to this magazine, there were not many people who owned automobiles or telephones at that time, especially if you think about the lower class population, okay? And of course, not everybody's gonna be subscribed to this magazine, okay? So those 10 million mock ballots are not a representative sample of the population of the United States at the time. And so, just drop my pen, sorry. And so that is one example of our selection bias. Let me kind of label that here. Okay, that's the selection bias piece. And then for our participation bias, that would be this next part, okay? 2 million ballots were returned, as opposed to the 10 million that were sent out, okay? Now, 2 million ballots might still seem like a lot, but think about that number in comparison to the original number, okay? For 10 million mock ballots to be sent out and only 2 million to be returned, that's a 2 out of 10 response rate, which is a 20% response rate, which is not very good, okay, considering what you were aiming for. So that right there is our participation bias, okay? And that can skew your results a lot. If you were expecting a certain response rate and you got significantly less, you have no idea what those 8 million ballots say, or what those 8 million ballots could have said that were not returned. Okay, that could have very well kept this magazine, helped the magazine to keep its reputation of predicting the election correctly. But it didn't, right? Because we didn't get those 8 million ballots. All right. So those are the 4 guidelines for this first part, okay? And let's just kind of review them really quick. This fourth one is all about sample bias. This third one is about confounding variables. The second one is about the source. And then the first one is all about like the introduction of the study. Are we having a good statement of our population goal and type? Okay, still pretty important, but we don't see this first one very often as compared to these next 3, all right? Cool, so hopefully that sounded good. We're gonna cover the the last 4 guidelines in our next video, and we'll go from there, okay? Let me know if you have any questions in class, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good rest of your day.